Hello and welcome back to Ye Olde Guide, your podcast guide to the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. And what a treat we have for you in today's episode. We will be visiting Shrewsbury. My name is Liam McGrath and I'm delighted to introduce urban historian Daniel Gooch. Daniel, welcome back to the show. Please give us a highlight of your week.
We had a great trip to Crewe at the weekend. That was good. I found out I'm having a son. That was a nice thing as well. My wife's pregnant, so
that's a highlight. Massive highlight.
That probably beats the trip to Crewe, I suppose. The son,
I think
son to go.
I really
son
think
to go
it
with
does.
the daughter.
I can't compete with that for a highlight of my week. And also, I went to Crewe. The Railway Heritage Centre was excellent. I do recommend that. Future episode on Crewe coming up somewhere in the pipeline. Well, in this episode, we're visiting Shrewsbury, which is an almost perfect and quintessentially English market town. So first things first, I've been saying Shrewsbury so far, but is it Shrewsbury or is it Shrewsbury? Everyone's asking me.
Well, you know, I've always said Shrewsbury forever. Shrewsbury, not Shrewsbury. But I used to work with someone who was from the town, and she told me that locals tend to call it Shrewsbury, everyone else tends to call it Shrewsbury. But ultimately, no one gets particularly het up about it. So pick what you want. So I'm going to stick with what I've always known. I'm going to call it Shrewsbury.
I'm going to be different. I'm going to call it Shrewsbury, if I can remember.
Shrewsbury or
Shrewsbury? The answer is, who cares? And people from Shrewsbury are called Salopians, I gather.
Yep, Salopians, from the alternative name for Shrewsbury and Shropshire, Salop. You'll often hear the football fans chant that at their games.
If it's your first time listening, welcome. Welcome new listeners and welcome old listeners, regular listeners. Welcome back. Do check out our website, yeoldeguide.com. Here we explain the podcast and its categories and its scoring. So yes, we split our historic review of Shrewsbury into 5 categories, and we do this to encourage ourselves to look at the places we visit from different perspectives. Well, let's start then with an overview of Shrewsbury. The town is located in the far west of England. It's the county town of Shropshire. It's not a huge town, but it has a really sizable hinterland that goes well into North Wales. Daniel, tell us a bit about the situation and history of Shrewsbury.
Yep, certainly. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's not a huge town. Its population is only about 70,000 today. But its historical importance, both economically and particularly militarily, definitely below its size. And you're absolutely right. That's really because of its location, with good transport links close to the English border with Wales. Think about the geography and the layout of the town. The historic town centre sits really very distinctly in a large loop of the River Severn that kind of goes round the town centre today. So the town is effectively on a peninsula which is defended by the river and a very narrow kind of isthmus, which, aside from the bridges, have been the only ever land entry into the town centre. Going back to the origins of the town, there was a Roman settlement nearby, and natural fords at Shrewsbury were probably used in Roman Britain and later in the Dark Ages as a crossing point across the River Severn. But the town's written and definitively known history starts later under the Anglo-Saxons. Shrewsbury was part of the kingdom of the Mercians, who built a mint here and probably fortified the town to control the river crossing. And the town actually got its name. Its name derives from the Old English Shrewsbury, which probably means either Scrob's Burr, Scrob being potentially a person, Burr being Saxon fortified town, or Burr in the shrubs. Following the Norman invasion, Shrewsbury Castle was built in 1074, which still stands today, and we'll talk more about that later. And the Domesday Book records that Shrewsbury had more than 250 houses and a population of about 1,200, so about 12% of London. So it probably puts it around the top 20 or so largest towns in the country at this time. But it did expand quite a lot, and by 1100 it was probably more like in the top 10 or so for population in England. Moving on, the town probably reached its overall relative peak in importance by the Middle Ages, when it became a really important military location in conflicts against Wales, and in more peaceful times, a hugely important market town and regional trade and political centre for Wales. Its population had dropped off a bit by the later Middle Ages, And aside from a small resurgence in the 17th century, the town has remained quite small since then, and pretty untouched, relatively speaking, by both industrial and kind of 20th century urban development, which is really reflected, I think, in the town's layout today, which still retains this very distinctive, tight medieval street plan and has over 600 listed buildings of various grades today.
And that's what really strikes you. It's got a really extensive, as well as well-preserved medieval centre and older buildings that seem to spread out further than's typical, and it hasn't had those large intrusions so much that other cities have had from more modern development. Well, that's a great overview. Now let's get into the categories. Our first category is politics and war. As we've mentioned, Shrewsbury has a very distinctive layout. Take a look at it from an aerial map. The town lies within a sharp meander of the River Severn, and while the river isn't huge at this point, it's certainly sufficient to act as a considerable defensive barrier, especially given the town's close proximity to Wales. And this really is essential to its political and military history, isn't it?
It is. I just want to echo what you've said about this overarching point about its geography. It's just immediately obvious when you enter the town or you see it, as you said, from above, how naturally fortified it is. Situated in this peninsula in the loop of the Severn, protected almost all the way around by the river. So it's no surprise at all to learn that the town's been fortified since Saxon times and the focus of military activity, particularly, as you say, in conflicts between Wales and England. Now, Shrewsbury has always been closely connected with Wales. It was actually the capital of the ancient kingdom of Powys, which is known today more as a modern Welsh county, but previously crossed the border into the English West Midlands. And in more modern times, Shrewsbury town actually competed regularly in the Welsh Cup before English sides were banned.
Let's talk a bit about some of those conflicts with the Welsh then. Anglo-Welsh
relations, certainly as they affect the town, haven't always been that harmonious, haven't always been about football and trade. And we can start in 1069 when the city was, or town I should say, it's always been a town, correct myself there, was besieged by Welsh forces who burned down the temporary wooden castle which has been erected shortly after the Norman conquest, and this town was actually relieved by William the Conqueror personally. And Shrewsbury was an important staging point for several other subsequent and not entirely successful invasions of Wales by English forces, by William the Conqueror's great-grandson, Henry II, in 1165, and by the Archbishop of Canterbury, of all people, in 1196. Really? Yep. I think this was at the time when Richard the Lionheart was king, who famously wasn't in the country very much, so presumably lots of his power was delegated out.
The A.B. of C doesn't strike you as the sort of the warmongering type, does he?
No, times change, don't they? And also by King John, famously unsuccessful military leader in 1211. But looking the other way, the Welsh forces also had their way with Shrewsbury. They captured and ransacked the town under Llywelyn the Great in 1215 and then in 1234. But probably the most important event in Anglo-Welsh relations happened in Shrewsbury in 1283 with the execution in the town of Dafydd ap Griffith, Wales' last independent ruler, which basically ended the Anglo-Welsh wars at that stage. As a side point, Dafydd was actually the first person in Britain ever to be executed under the law of high treason, and the first really notable person in history to be hand-drawn in quarters. There's another little bit of a first there for Shrewsbury.
Well, we should give some well said on old Dafydd ap Griffith. Very well said.
Well, my wife is Welsh. She'd
there we go.
Be disappointed.
You've been taught well.
I've been taught well, exactly. We should give some context to this, actually, because it's worth lingering on a bit more, because this event was really kind of the climax of Edward I's famous campaigns against the Welsh, and Dafydd was brother to the famous Llywelyn ap Griffith. He actually succeeded Llywelyn when Llywelyn was killed in December 1282, so he was only actually leader for a few months. Now, Edward's forces had overwhelmed the independent areas of Wales with a massive army, and Dafydd was forced to retreat and then hide in the mountains around Snowdonia before being captured in June 1283. And Edward then called a parliament in Shrewsbury specifically for the purpose of having Dafydd condemned to death in the town, which happened on 30th September 1283. He was dragged through the streets, tethered to a horse, hanged alive, had his innards cut out before The executioner, who was aptly called Geoffrey of Shrewsbury, cut his body into 4 pieces. So very, very grisly end.
The location of Shrewsbury has given it this incredible history with the Welsh, akin to what we found in Lancaster, with centre in conflict with the Scottish. Any Welsh listeners, please do give us feedback on the pronunciation. I thought it was very good. I think we should talk about probably the most famous battle in Shrewsbury, the Battle of Shrewsbury.
Absolutely. Given that it's depicted very prominently in Shakespeare, this was essentially a battle between the forces of Henry IV, who is probably one of the lesser-known Henrys, despite the fact that Shakespeare wrote more than one play about him, and the family of Henry Percy, Duke of Northumberland. Now, this character, Henry Percy, he might sound even more obscure unless you've read or seen Henry IV, Part 1. But there are actually a couple of notable present-day cultural derivations from him. First, his nickname, Hotspur, which is more famously known by, is where Tottenham Hotspur got their name from, as his family owned land near the club's first home ground. And secondly, if you ever watched the first 2 series of Blackadder, Lord Percy is from the same family. He's actually specifically called in one episode the heir to the Duchy of Northumberland. So if you need to stick a face on Henry Percy, Hotspur, as we're going through this, just imagine Lord Percy from Blackadder, and that'll get you there. And as for the conflict itself, the background to this really lies in the deposition by Henry IV of his cousin Richard II. The Percy family had supported Henry in the deposition and in Henry's later military campaigns, but they weren't given certain lands in the north that they claimed Henry had promised them in return for their support. And as a consequence of this, the Percys rebelled in July 1403. They were led by Hotspur and his uncle Thomas, and marched south from their base in Northumberland, recruiting an army along the way. Now, both sides arrived near Shrewsbury and camped there on the 20th of July 1403. And battle commenced the next day in an area just to the north of Shrewsbury, which today is named, not particularly imaginatively, Battlefield, but at least it helps you find where it is. The number of troops involved is disputed, but it's generally agreed that the royal forces were definitely more numerous. Initially, negotiations were opened, but the Percys refused to accept any of the king's terms, so battle started at dusk. The Percys archers got the best of it at first, and Prince Henry, the later much more famous Henry V, was hit by an arrow and left with this permanent scar on his face, which he's sometimes depicted with. But the subsequent charge of the Percys' forces led to Hotspur's death, which ultimately was the catalyst to end the battle. As you'd imagine, Hotspur suffered a pretty grisly fate after he was killed. It's reported that in the town of Shrewsbury, his body was salted all over, which I presume was for preservation purposes, and again cut to pieces with the different parts sent all around the country. Another one.
Another one.
Like grisly executions in Shrewsbury, it seems.
It does seem that way.
Does.
And I think on Ye Olde guide, we always like to try and bring it back to what you can see in the town, but you can visit the battlefield, and it's got a church.
Yes, you can go to Battlefield. It has the Battlefield Heritage Park, which has information panels as a walking tour, and there's an exhibition centre, plus Battlefield Church, which was built in 15th century to replace a chapel that had been commissioned by Henry IV after the battle. But as well as the physical legacy, there's also a more abstract cultural legacy from the battle today, which derives really from Shakespeare's depiction. You can see the battle depicted in Orson Welles' film Chimes at Midnight, which also derived from the Shakespeare play, which shows the battle as basically kind of a muddy pit of carnage, which gives us that classic perception we have of medieval battles. So it's a very influential battle in cultural sense through Shakespeare, through film depictions, and also in the physical legacy it's left in the town of Shrewsbury today.
We've got some other conflicts which we'll go over more briefly because we've covered the anarchy in the Lincoln episode. But do you want to briefly mention the anarchy and the Civil War?
It's a bit of a shame we haven't got more time to dwell on these, but we can certainly mention them. In the anarchy, which was the 12th century civil war between Stephen and Matilda, contenders to the English throne, which, as you said, we covered more in our Lincoln episode, the town was captured by Stephen following a siege in 1138. And moving on further than that, Shrewsbury also saw conflict in the more famous civil war, the Civil War. Initially, the whole of Shropshire was a major centre of royalist support. Shrewsbury was actually the first major town Charles I visited after he raised his standard at Nottingham to effectively begin the war, and the first place where he found significant support. Shrewsbury was also the location of a council of war during the conflict, which was held by the king's nephew and royalist commander Prince Rupert. And again, a key point here is that Shrewsbury was important because it controlled logistical and economic access to Wales. Despite being held by the royalists at first, the town and castle were later captured by the parliamentarians in 1645. A fairly famous episode here is when a dozen Irish soldiers were killed at this point in response to a parliamentary decree, which is the very sinister sounding ordinance of no quarter, that no quarter should be given to any Irish soldiers fighting during the war.
So we found ourselves there with a large number of really quite interesting military incidents and battles, and that has left some legacy, if we say the battlefield, but also the Shropshire Regimental Museum. It feels like Shrewsbury's the right place for it to be. Let's talk a bit about politics.
Yep, certainly, because Shrewsbury was certainly a real centre of regional political power. Between the 15th and the 17th centuries, the Council of the Welsh Marchers, which is the Marches being the border area between England and Wales, met in Shrewsbury often. Some meetings were held in what is today the old council house. Most of this building is a modern restoration. The only remaining 16th century element is a wall, but at least you have the location there where these meetings took place. But there's also a bit of a national political legacy in Shrewsbury as well. If we go back to the 1283 Parliament, which we mentioned earlier, which concluded the Anglo-Welsh Wars, this met in a building that still exists called Parliament Barn. And it was important not only because of the specific military conclusions, but because it was the first parliament to which commoners were invited. Ooh. Commoners are just simply being non-nobility. So some have argued here that the origins of the House of Commons, and therefore you could say in a loose sense British democracy, lay in this parliament in Shrewsbury.
Or you have to make these claims for your town. I think you have to. Although I do feel it's the third place we visited where we've mentioned national parliaments. I think Reading and Coventry, we mentioned them. Good, it's all interesting points.
We've got an interesting, unique first here, though. I think we can say that for Shrewsbury.
And other notable people from Shrewsbury, 1761, Robert Clive of India.
Very famous figure from British imperial history, lived nearby and was MP for Shrewsbury, as you said, from 1761 right up to his death in 1774, and actually mayor of the town in 1762. He had various other connections with the town and Shropshire institutions, and today has a statue in the centre of Shrewsbury. As we said, it's a very famous name, and he's most notable as an imperial governor, and effectively, some would argue, the founder of the British Empire in India. He worked for the East India Company, who, despite being a private enterprise, actually administered much of India before the British government assumed control. He worked his way through the company to lead the company's forces, because it had its own army, to victory against the French and the Bengalese forces at the Battle of Plassey, which gave the company effective control of the region of Bengal. But as an imperial figure, his legacy, as you'd expect, is not uncontroversial. Many have admired his achievements, not just those of his own personal development and his conquest, but also of defeating the French and really kind of stymiing their threat to Britain. But of course others, not just recently, but it has to be said within his lifetime and since then, have criticised the quality and care of his administration, particularly during the 1770 Great Bengal Famine. More recently, there have been calls for his statue to be removed, but it remains there still, following a council vote in the last few years, which voted to keep it there.
There's a big statue of him at the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. Thousands of people just pour past it. It's still there.
Still there, like the one in Shrewsbury. We can talk about other kind of royal connections to Shrewsbury as well. I think they're quite interesting. Several monarchs have visited the town, notably Henry I, who stayed there at one point to receive the surrender of the local earl who'd rebelled against him. And also Henry VII, it feels like all the Henrys have been there at some point. He stayed in Shrewsbury the night before the Battle of Bosworth Field, supposedly in what is today a restaurant called Henry Tudor House. They do seem to like give places obvious names in Shrewsbury. He'd actually advanced in from Wales, and Shrewsbury was the first town he marched on in England. So effectively, it was his gateway into the country. And finally, one of the famous princes in the Tower, who were, to my mind, probably murdered by Richard III, was born in Shrewsbury in 1473. He's the younger of the two princes, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. Again, if you need to visualise him, I don't know how helpful it is, but he was the one that was played by Brian Blessed in Blackadder in the first series. Grew into a big, strong boy, as they said.
Good for a podcast.
What, Brian Blessed as a guest?
Might have some techniques on diaphragmatic breathing. Well, that was a vast amount. I kind of lost track of my Henrys there. That was a huge amount of battles. But I suppose what I have to bring you back to, and I think let's summarise. So I'll let you summarise in a moment. How much of that do you feel when you visit Shrewsbury, and how much legacy has it left as a visitor, do you think?
Well, I think it forms a pretty crucial part of Shrewsbury's kind of urban feel today. You've got, similar to what we discussed in Lincoln, how the geographical situation of Lincoln, up a hill with the old defensible area around the castle, separates it uniquely and gives you a feel of a kind of a city as an old medieval fortress. You have the same feel in Shrewsbury, this defensible fortress-like geographic layout of the town, in the kind of the castle protecting the land entry plus its museum, surrounded by this river, but also in the battlefield visitor facilities and in those remaining political buildings that really are kind of a crucial part of the physical and historical mythology of the town. And if you talk kind of more generally about, if we're going to kind of sum up and do scores now, I think on battles, more abstractly, there is a real diversity here. We've seen that the strategic location of the town on the Welsh border was very crucial to Shrewsbury's status as a centre of conflict. As you mentioned, absolutely, it's very similar to the Anglo-Scottish dimension we saw to Lancaster's history in our last episode, but really turned up much further, I think, in Shrewsbury. Yeah. And it also played an important role in purely domestic battles, as we saw with the Battle of Shrewsbury and the Civil War. There's also been really quite a lot to say, I think, on politics, both on a national and a regional level. The only reason I would temper my score slightly is because there will be other places that have, simply as a result of their size, experienced more or perhaps had even more of an influence on national or even international politics. But I think it's still very impressive, and to answer your question, very well celebrated in the feel and facilities of the town today. So I'm going to give Shrewsbury a 7.5.
The museum had lots of coverage. We've got the battlefield, and it does have that feel, and a huge number of battles of different eras. So for me, it'll be a 7.
14.5 out of 20 is definitely a very good score for Shrewsbury.
For science and industry, we really have to start with one of the most famous individual scientists in history, born in Shrewsbury, 1809, lived there for a long time. We're talking about Charles Darwin, and he's perhaps most famous for his proposition that all species of life have evolved from common ancestors. Hugely influential, his 1859 book on the origin of species is considered to be the foundation of evolutionary history, and is readily readable to non-scientists. He did lots of other stuff as well, and we could talk endlessly about Darwin, but let's try and talk about how Shrewsbury shaped Darwin.
Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, as you said, in 1809. He lived there for nearly 30 years. And I agree, we don't really have the expertise or the time to go through all of the achievements and importance of his studies, and I think most people have some familiarity with that. But what we should focus on is the fact he spent so much of his life, including his formative years and his formative education in Shrewsbury. To go through it chronologically, he was born in Mount House and baptised at St Chad's Church, which are both places that you can visit today. He was educated at Shrewsbury School in the original school building, which the school left in 1882 and now serves as a library. It's very close to the station. You walk past it as you're walking into the town centre from the station, and it has a very impressive life-size statue of Darwin right outside the entrance. But he's also celebrated in other ways in the town too, as well as multiple rows, the shopping centre named after him. There is the Quantum Leap sculpture, which we saw on our visit. It was built next to the river in 2009 for the 200th anniversary of his birth. It's a very quirky design. It's kind of, I think, deliberately ambiguous. It could be a spring or it could be a helix. Personally, I think it looks like a rib cage. But whatever it is, it was very expensive. It cost over £1 million. It's fair to say that not all locals were happy with that cost, but no doubt they do seem to be mostly very proud of their association with Darwin.
I mean, as they should be. And look, I mean, one of the things that really struck me, I was listening to some of the Darwin Festival, which is held in Shrewsbury, and it's got some excellent videos and podcasts that you can listen to online. And one of the presenters talked about how some of the reasons why Shrewsbury was the perfect crucible for someone of Darwin's skills and abilities to sort of take an interest in evolutionary biology. And they talked about things like the geology of Shropshire, which is highly varied, lots of interesting stones and rocks. Darwin apparently collected rocks that he'd find in the local area, but also his family, his upbringing. Well, one of his grandfathers was Wedgeworth, famous pottery company, and his innovations were about experimentation. And his family were nonconformists, they were abolitionists. He was baptised in St Chad's, but that was so he could get an education. So that whole sort of Midlands Enlightenment, combined with the geology of Shropshire, seems to have given this inspiration to Darwin, both in terms of his inquisitiveness of the natural earth, its process of change, its glacial change, but also thorough experimentation, which is a trademark of his science.
That's very interesting. I suppose the challenge would always be if you picked him up and gave him an upbringing in a different part of the country, would that have yielded the same results? Would he have come up with the same theories, the same works, the same results? But I suppose you'll never know. But it's interesting.
It's a very interesting question, and I think it is about that Midlands. Really, when the Midlands was nearby Ironbridge Gorge, for example, Coalbrookdale was the crucible of the Industrial Revolution and scientific progress in many ways, which brings us on, I suppose, to talking about the more industrial heritage of Shrewsbury. Let's talk first of all about the pre-industrial, what went on in Shrewsbury before the Industrial Revolution, because it's this huge centre. We've talked about it having a large medieval street pattern. What was driving this? What was it for?
In the pre-industrial era, Shrewsbury was an incredibly important market centre. We've talked already a lot about Shrewsbury's regional importance in political and military terms, but this also absolutely applied economically. The urban historian Peter Borsay ranks it as one of the 7 most important regional centres outside London, even as late as 1700. And this isn't so much to do with size or population, because its population even then was only about 7,500, which was a quarter of Norwich's, and no bigger, smaller in fact than many other kind of mid-tier towns, which are profoundly less important. But really it's more because of what Borsay calls the range and depth of its influence. This was in trade as well as politics, which was far greater than that of something of the status of merely a county town. And in Shrewsbury's case, this is because, once again, it was through its location and its transport connections, the trading and cultural centre for huge areas of Wales, as well as England. Wales, which really lacked anything like as big an urban centre. And historical accounts really do demonstrate this quite well. One Elizabethan writer described the town as full of traffic with Welshmen rich and wealthy, for hither almost all the commodities of Wales do conflow, as it were a common mart of both nations. And the market was absolutely crucial to both Welsh and Western English trade. Daniel Defoe, who we talk about every week, fantastic source for these things, said in the 1770s, here is the greatest market, the greatest plenty of good provisions, and the cheapest that is to be met with in all of the western part of England. But the reverse was also true, that as well as Shrewsbury having a massive impact on the economies of Wales and Western England, the trade had a huge impact on the economy and character of Shrewsbury itself. Defoe said in 1776, they speak all English in the town, but on a market day, you would think you were in Wales. More generally, one account describes Shrewsbury as full of gentry and yet full of trade too. Well, and again, Defoe described it as a beautiful and rich town, one of the most flourishing in England. And it's probably also a mark of the town's importance that it was one of the first provincial towns in the country to have its own newspaper in 1705. Borsay again only records London, Norwich, Bristol and Exeter as having newspapers before them. So I think it's pretty clear that acting as this trading gateway between England and Wales was enormously important, both for the town and for more widely in economic interactions between markets in the two countries.
And I think that sort of goes on today, doesn't it? I mean, even if you look on a map today, you go west of Shrewsbury and there really isn't any sizable settlements before Aberystwyth. Let's talk about Shrewsbury in the industrial era. So I mentioned that this area is the crucible, really, of the Industrial Revolution. What role did Shrewsbury play?
Yeah, beyond acting as a market centre, Shrewsbury did have some manufacturing in its own right. It had a strong leather industry in the 14th century, was an early centre of the clay pipe industry, and later had a thriving wool industry up to the 17th century, which helped provide lots of the wealth to construct so many of those grand Tudor and Stuart buildings that remain in the town. But similar to what we saw in Lancaster, it didn't really undergo very much expansion following the Industrial Revolution. And remarkably for a town of this size, it actually decreased in population in the mid-19th century when most other urban centres were rocketing up in population. But nonetheless, there was still some active and important later industry there. We can draw out the Sentinel Wagon Works, which was established here in 1905, specifically to be next to the London North Western Railway's main line, and produced lots of important steam-powered commercial vehicles. And while industry didn't exactly transform Shrewsbury, which is obvious when you walk around the town today and see its urban character, the local spinning trade did give us the Ditherington Flax Mill, which was a really important milestone in the history of architecture and construction because it was the first iron-framed building anywhere in the world. The mill, which is Grade 1 listed and was built in 1797, is called the father of all skyscrapers by English Heritage and many other institutions, specifically because this iron-frame concept is the basis on which later steel-framed skyscraper structures were first developed. The mill itself was, unsurprisingly, as you might think, initially used as a mill, but then later as a maltings, and in use right up to 1987, so it was in active use for nearly 200 years. I think it's currently being restored now and has a visitor centre, which I think was due to reopen about now. We didn't get a chance to pop down when we were there, but I think right about now, spring 2022 was the opening time.
Opening spring 2022. I think the interesting thing about this building, it's described as the father of skyscrapers. It's not a skyscraper by any stretch of the imagination. It's 5 stories high, but it's that cast iron frame that's innovative. And that, to me, connects it with the innovation of using cast iron structurally, which was happening nearby Coalbrookdale. The famous Iron Bridge was the most famous early use of cast iron structurally. And the nearby cast iron aqueduct of the Shrewsbury Canal, which is just outside Shrewsbury, Telford's 1796 cast iron aqueduct, which you can still see, although the canal is closed. The building is part of the narrative of the history of this area, cast iron being used structurally. Terrible structural material, by the way. It's just started breaking, railway accidents, Tay Bridge disaster, that sort of thing. Very rigid, I think is the problem. The Ditherington Flax Mill is still there.
Yep, so that's lasted well. Should we do scores?
Yes, we should do the scores. Who can not be a fan of Charles Darwin? And I think there is sufficient celebration of Darwin to... You could almost do a Darwin trail, couldn't you? I don't think there is one. There should be one. That would be my recommendation, because there's so many places in Shrewsbury that you can associate with him, that you've mentioned, the school, St Chad's. And there is a Darwin Festival, which is a great celebration. I would love to go. You could probably tell from my enthusiasm for the Ditherington Flax Mill that I just find this sort of feature of this part of the world as a sort of early industrial revolution. I find it really interesting. And we can see that in the building. It's a shame it wasn't open when we visited, but it's about to be open, this visitor centre. So on that basis, I'll be giving it a 7. 7,
another good score there. My thoughts, I think you could perhaps say that Shrewsbury lacks maybe a little bit in breadth in this category, but my view is it more than makes up for that in depth. It's played a key role in the formative years of one of the most important scientific minds in all history. It's been hugely important to the trade of large and important regions of Britain, and I think most importantly, you can still see the remnants of this in Shrewsbury today. With Darwin and the sculptures and monuments and visitor attractions, I think you're absolutely right. Some kind of trail would be absolutely perfect to augment that. But also with trade and in the wonderfully preserved Tudor and Stuart buildings, which do define the town's urban character. And also, bonus points, I didn't mention the cloth trade once. I think this is probably the first episode where we haven't had to talk about the cloth trade. We mentioned the wool trade, but that's slightly different. No finished cloth in that. So I'm very happy. So I am also going to give it a 7.
The next category is arts and culture. And, well, a town as beautiful as Shrewsbury must have a lot of culture. As you walk around Shrewsbury, you were struck by a large amount of green, kind of slow-paced English charm. Let's first of all talk about Shrewsbury's greenery, its sort of centre of leisure, and of course, flowers.
One of the biggest visitor draws to Shrewsbury today is the annual Shrewsbury Flower Show. It's the longest running flower show in the world, and it's held in the Quarry, which is a lovely park in the centre of Shrewsbury, with, not surprising, an old quarry at its centre, still sitting within the loop of the Severn, so still very much central to the town. The origins of horticultural shows in Shrewsbury really go back to a carnation and gooseberry show in Frankwell, just over the Welsh Bridge, which was first held in 1836. And this was more of a trade fair, meant to entice trade and visitors, and other flower shows were held since. But the present Shrewsbury Flower Show really dates back formally to 1875, when the Shropshire Horticultural Society was established. But the show has always been kind of more of a broader cultural event. You have TV personalities there. I gather the Hairy Bikers have been there recently, singers like Catherine Jenkins these days. But there have also been fireworks shows and historically variety acts like tightrope walkers and aeroplane flyovers. And if we're talking about festivals, I think we should also talk about the Shrewsbury Folk Festival, because it is a fairly modern innovation. It's been held annually in August since 2006, but it's a successor to the Bridgnorth Folk Festival, which started a bit earlier in 1997. It was previously also held at the Quarry, but is now at the West Midlands Showground, which is just outside the centre of town, really not too far out at all. We can only give the festival a brief mention here. There's a lot to get through, and it isn't admittedly particularly historical in its own right. But what I think is important about this is it does celebrate this distinctly and historically British style of music, along with other traditional aspects of British culture, such as Morris dancing and Scottish traditional dancing, which are also spread around the town during the festival. So, along with the flower show, I definitely think the folk festival has its place in this category.
I think that's right. And to this day, you just feel it's a place to walk around and take in the surroundings, the river, coming round, there's boat trips, there's all the greenery of the Quarry, wonderfully planted gardens and trees. But this goes back a long way, doesn't it? It goes back to Georgian times.
Yeah, absolutely. Shrewsbury was no doubt a major kind of Georgian cultural centre. To get the context in there, many historians have described Shrewsbury as a Georgian leisure town, and the town definitely acquired lots of new leisure facilities to reflect this. It's recorded as having a bowling green, new churches, horse racing, concerts, plays, walks, gardens, and coffee houses. One contemporary even says that Shrewsbury had the most coffee houses that I ever saw in any town. I don't know how well travelled this person was, but it's still high praise for if you like coffee. But the town's greatest remnant today is probably the ballroom in the Lion Hotel. This was added by the landlord in the 1770s in order to hold assemblies, which were basically formal dances for the gentry. And these were held in Shrewsbury as frequently as every week. And more generally, they were a central part of this kind of burgeoning urban social scene in Georgian Britain. On the ballroom itself, probably its most interesting feature, if you can get in there, is the dome in the middle of the ceiling. But it also has some very noticeable tall arched windows and paintings of dancers on the entrance door. So it really is this terrific physical remnant of this important part of Shrewsbury's history.
Let's move on to people from Shrewsbury that have made an impact in arts and culture. Let's start with literature.
Yeah, there's quite a really notable literary tradition in Shrewsbury. But before we start with people from Shrewsbury, I'll start with a fun one, which is probably Charles Dickens. He stayed in the Lion Hotel, which we just mentioned. Now, this isn't particularly noteworthy, as he was kind of the pop star of his generation. He was always on tour and frankly seems to have stayed everywhere in every town we look at. But what's interesting here is that one version of one of his most famous books, A Christmas Carol, was filmed in the town in 1984, presumably because Shrewsbury looked so much like a traditional English town, and it left behind a pretty spooky remnant that you can still see today. On the film itself, this version was only filmed for TV, but had some success and has been repeated quite a lot since. It did include some pretty well-known actors. Frank Finlay, who brilliantly portrayed the Witch Smell of Pursuivant in Blackadder. I think that's the third time I've mentioned Blackadder today. And Edward Woodward of The Wicker Man, he was in it. David Warner and Liz Smith, who played Letitia in The Vicar of Dibley. But as for the spooky remnant, you have to look in the graveyard of St Chad's Church. If you look very carefully, you can see a gravestone for one Ebenezer Scrooge, which was used as a prop in the film and just left there. And it took you a mere while to find it, didn't it? But we can confirm we found it. It's definitely there.
That's 10 minutes we're never getting back. I get called Ebenezer Scrooge sometimes when I turn the heating down. It's well worth going to the graveyard, by the way, because it gets fantastic views of St Chad's Church.
I must admit, at one point I did wonder, is this some local joke? It's not actually here, but we did eventually manage to find it. Let's
move on to a more tragic figure, Wilfred Owen.
Wilfred Owen, yes, who lived, studied and taught in Shrewsbury. Owen was one of the most famous poets of the First World War. He's famous for writing kind of in contrast to a prevailing cultural, you might even say, nationalism, patriotism, jingoism and wrote more about the horrors rather than the glory of war. His famous poems include Dulcet Decorum Est, Futility and Anthem for Doomed Youth. So even if you haven't read his poetry, you don't have to look too far beyond the titles to really grasp his theme. Talking about his connection specifically with Shrewsbury, he lived in Shrewsbury from the age of about 4, moved away for a short time and then came back to the town in his teens. He taught at the Wild Cop School, and his family remained in the town when he enlisted and served in the army. And tragically, it was in Shrewsbury that his mother received the news of his death, which had happened a week previously on Armistice Day 1918. Now, Owen perhaps isn't hugely memorialised in Shrewsbury today, but there is the Wilfred Owen School, there's a sculpture in his memory in the Abbey Gardens, some plaques and a road named after him, so he has at least left some presence in the town.
Finally, a novelist from Shrewsbury.
Yes, Mary Webb. Mary Webb, an Edwardian novelist who's, I think, famous, you might say, for writing about English rural life in a kind of descriptive but really resigned, fatalistic style. One of her novels, Gone to Earth, was filmed in 1950, so some of your listeners might know her through that. Webb was born near to Shrewsbury and lived in the town, and her first published writing was actually a piece on the 1907 Shrewsbury rail accident in a local paper. Her brother sent it in against her knowledge, and it was chosen for publication. The former Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, called Webb a neglected genius when she died, and she did see a bit of a revival in fame from the 1930s. She actually inspired a famous parody by Stella Gibbons in 1932, which was called Cold Comfort Farm. So I think the title tells you all you need to know about her view on Webb and what she was trying to satirise there. This was also filmed in 1995. It starred Kate Beckinsale and Stephen Fry. So again, you might know her, Mary Webb's work indirectly through this. And Webb was buried in Shrewsbury Cemetery just outside the town centre. So I think overall, between modern film adaptations, a tragic poet, and perhaps underappreciated female author, we have maybe a small but a nicely varied literary tradition in Shrewsbury.
There's a lot there, and in this category there's more, because and it's unusual for us to mention a school, but I think we have to, because it's had so much influence. I think we have to mention Shrewsbury School.
Absolutely. Shrewsbury School is very important and famous as one of the 9 original great public schools as defined by Parliament, which passed the Public Schools Act in 1868 specifically to regulate these specified schools. This included other world famous names such as Eton and Harrow. And just for anyone who might be listening from abroad unfamiliar with the terminology, public school here does refer to private, not state schools, because they were public in the sense they were open, at least in theory, to all, not just members of a particular religion or children of those working in a particular trade. And to be honest, it was quite difficult to work out where to fit Shrewsbury School in this podcast. We could have looked at its political alumni, like Michael Heseltine, the former Deputy Prime Minister, or perhaps focused more on it as it influenced its scientific alumni, like we touched on with Darwin. But personally, I think its most interesting output has been in the world of culture. Its famous alumni include Michael Palin, Paul Dane, who wrote the script for Goldfinger, among other films. If you remember 90s TV presenters, Nick Hancock and Nick Owen, and John Peel, who seemed to have gained his passion for music and for writing at the school, but by all accounts developed his affected Scouse accent subsequently.
But I think the big one has to be Private Eye.
Yeah, an abstract alumnus, the satirical magazine Private Eye. It started at Shrewsbury School as the Silesian, a magazine published there in the 1950s by the magazine's founders, who were pupils at the school. And they later reformed the magazine at Oxford University under the name Private Eye. So it's given us one of our kind of greatest satirical cultural outputs in this country.
Oh, like an institution.
Yep, absolutely.
A great thing to buy before a long train journey to Shrewsbury.
And it's bucking the trend, I gather, of paper sales being down and online reading being up. It seems to have record sales at the moment.
Okay, so and the last thing to mention, I think, in Shrewsbury, I've never eaten one. I didn't get round to eating it, I'm afraid. Could you tell us a bit about the local cake?
There's a couple of them, actually. Its first namesake is Shrewsbury Simnel cake, which is the second most popular recipe of the traditional English Easter dish Simnel cake, behind the berry variant, the berry Simnel cake. Now, I have to be honest, I have definitely heard of Simnel cake and know of its association with Easter, but I don't think I've ever actually seen or tried one. So I had to look it up for this podcast. It's a fruit cake with a marzipan topping. Kind of sounds like a kind of Christmas cake topped with a cross with a Battenberg. I'm sure it's very nice. But the second cake is more simply called Shrewsbury cake. Again, I've never had one, but I've seen pictures, and to be honest, it looks more like a biscuit to me than a cake. But according to the BBC, they are very popular in India. So that's a nice little export from Shrewsbury to the world of something that's very traditionally English.
That's right, that's true. And I feel terrible I didn't try one. Wow, that was a lot. That's a huge amount on culture.
It was. So I suppose to do scores now. Absolutely. Let's be honest. We've had a bit of a thin run recently on this topic. So it's been really nice today just to go to a place which actually has something to talk about in this category. I'm not scraping the barrel at all for things to talk about. And what's, I think, really nice, and as a kind of unifying theme about Shrewsbury's cultural heritage, is that there's something quite traditionally, you might even say stereotypically, English about it all. You know, folk shows, flower shows, impertinent satire, an alternative culture, as well as one of our greatest tragic poets and some, let's be honest, not particularly exciting cuisine. I think these are all very, very traditionally English things. So it's fantastic to have something to talk about and something unifying about it all. So for me, it's definitely going to be a positive score. It's going to be a 6.5.
Do you know, when I was thinking about this category, my immediate reaction was, oh yeah, well, there's lots here, but there's not much sort of international. And then I had that realisation that you've had, that actually it's the Englishness that unifies it. And I'll give it a 7.
Fantastic. So that's 13.5 out of 20. Again, that's a positive score. That is a good score in this category. It must be the highest anyone's had for art and culture since, I don't know, Great Yarmouth, probably. So it's doing well so far, Shrewsbury.
The fourth category is urban landscape. And as we've mentioned already, Shrewsbury has this extensive collection of medieval buildings and intact street layout. But before we go on to that, let's just go over the sort of the context of the layout of the town.
Yeah, certainly. It's definitely worth recapping because these are so important to it. You've got, within this distinctive river loop of the town, the centre has this original medieval street plan, and you really do notice as you walk through the town that there are very few straight streets, which gives the place a really tight kind of enclosed feel. especially in contrast to the wide green spaces of the Quarry Park that sit between the central area with these streets and the river. And distinctive to these streets are these small passageways, known locally as shuts, which weave round the back of the buildings in the town centre. And within that street plan, really, I think you'd have to say the kind of architectural jewel of Shrewsbury is not one single building, but the town as a whole. The famous architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner calls the town a museum of fine buildings and said that it's England's finest Tudor town. So from Pevsner, that's very high praise indeed. One thing that's quite important about it is the timber-framed buildings which do so characterise the town. They're not actually medieval, despite what you might think. People describe it as a medieval town, but while the streetscape is medieval, these buildings are all either Tudor, Stuart, or some kind of modern replica, some modern pastiche, which is, as I said, quite surprisingly to some. Aside from the street layout itself, the only real medieval remnants are the abbey and a few churches. There are also the remains of some medieval stone houses. You've got the music hall and a couple of houses in Pride Hill, but really nothing you can see from the outside. And these are certainly less impressive than the full medieval houses we saw preserved in Lincoln. And moving beyond the Tudor era, if you walk up Belmont, that's well worth a stroll up, because Belmont was a fashionable 18th century road and is a very good place to explore some of the best later Stuart and Georgian houses. One thing to look out for while you're there, as was quite common at this time, many of the houses have this very grand, solid-looking brick facade, but actually a much older wooden frame behind. So they are very often a lot older than they look.
Another thing that strikes you as well, the timber frame buildings kind of pile on top of each other, and that's partly because it's slightly hilly, isn't it? You've got the quite steep, I'm thinking Wilecott coming in towards the high street, but then you've got the flat floodplain low down around the river. So it gives you quite a bit of drama, and from the river, a bit of a skyline of historic buildings, but within the town, this sense of enclosure.
Absolutely, fully agree with that.
And I suppose if we're going to talk about the skyline, let's move on to the biggest buildings that you see. We've already briefly mentioned the castle. I think that's the building that towers over.
Absolutely. I mean, it is very hard to pick out any one particular building from Shrewsbury, but I think the castle is probably a good first place to start. It was built out of red sandstone in 1074 by Roger Montgomery, the first Earl of Shrewsbury, who was basically given the town as his lands by William the Conqueror. He pulled down 50 houses, which I make, based on the Domesday Book survey, to be something like 15% of the town's stock, to construct it. So it was a really dramatic and important development at the time. The castle was built on that thin gap, which is just 300 yards across between the river on this river loop, which meant this was, until the bridges were built, the only land entry into Shrewsbury, so a very important area to defend. And the castle complex was originally quite a bit bigger than it is today. The outer bailey originally went right down to Castle Street, which you can see on the map is somewhere away from the remaining part of the castle. And while parts of the original inner bailey do remain, the castle was defortified after the Civil War and converted later to accommodation by Thomas Telford for Sir William Pulteney, who was reputedly the richest man in England, and after whom the Pulteney Bridge in Bath was named. There was further restoration work done in the 1920s, and the castle today contains the Shropshire Regimental Museum. And one very interesting artefact in that museum is a lock of Napoleon's hair. And the reason it's there was it was presented to an officer of the town's regiment when they were assigned to guard him during his exile on St Helena. So it's definitely well worth a look around the museum today.
It's a good museum, and also it's good to visit the castle just for some great views across the town as well. Other massively important and influential buildings in Shrewsbury, and I think you mentioned it earlier, Shrewsbury Abbey.
Absolutely. The Shrewsbury Abbey was founded just a little bit after the castle in 1083, but again also by the same man, Roger Montgomery, founded as a Benedictine monastery. It was closed in 1540 following the dissolution of the monasteries, and only the Abbey Church of the whole complex remains today. There have been suggestions that it could have been turned into a cathedral, and therefore Shrewsbury could at this point have become a city after the dissolution, but apparently the locals refused this. They preferred to remain a large town. One little interesting fact about the Abbey, Liam, do you remember Cadfile? It was an ITV series when we were children, I think. This is a kind of 12th century ecclesiastical detective series on ITV. It starred Derek Jacobi as, I think, this kind of crime-solving monastery herbalist. Well, the relevance here is that Cadfile was set in Shrewsbury Abbey in the 12th century. So if you want a fictional depiction of monastic life in medieval Shrewsbury, have a watch of Cadfile.
Brilliant. And I remember when we visited the Abbey, we remarked just across the road there's remnants of a pulpit. I think it's Grade 1 listed. And in the museum, the Shrewsbury Museum, you can see a model of a fully extensive the Abbey complex. And
the restored Shrewsbury Abbey station right next to it. Wasn't expecting to see that. Not operating anymore, but you can go and climb the platforms and occasionally go into the buildings. That was a nice surprise.
Another thing well worth a look is the Shrewsbury Prison.
This originally opened in 1793, and there are some remains from this original construction still there. But the current Victorian building, which is next to the station and the castle, was built on top of that original building in 1877. It's known locally as the Dana and was closed as a prison in 2003. But most importantly, and pretty refreshingly, it's now open permanently to the public as a tourist destination. And it describes itself as the world's most interactive prison. As well as touring the cells, you can play this modern phenomenon of escape games there. The prison was actually mentioned in the poem A Shropshire Lad by A. Houseman and was used as a filming location by several TV channels. In the Sky One series Lucky Man, it was used as White Cross Prison, and in their series The Queen and I. ITV have filmed Prey, Coronation Street and Bancroft there, and also Paranormal Lockdown and Most Haunted have been filmed there. But overall, for me,
have been filmed in this town.
They have, I suppose, as we say, it's got buildings from every year. If you want kind of a particular thematic location, I think Shrewsbury's got something for you. With the prison, I think my main takeaway from it was just how brilliant it is to see some life in public use in this recently decommissioned public heritage. It's what we were talking about in Lancaster, it's what we were talking about in the Reading episode. It's so refreshing to see it actually happen, some good public use made out of it. So well done, Shrewsbury.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, this was a bit of a walk out of the town centre, although quite an interesting walk. Slightly out of the town is the Lord Hill's Column. And this is just of extraordinary scale.
Absolutely. It's an amazing sight. Lord Hill's Column is actually the tallest Doric column in England, over 40 metres high. It's both wider and higher than Nelson's Column. That is specifically if you compare the columns only and not the pedestals, which admittedly are... The pedestal under Nelson's Column is definitely bigger and grander. Doric, just to clarify what I mean by that, that's a particular classical architectural order. It's arguably the simplest and least ornate compared with other kinds of column, and it is very commonly used on these individual standalone memorial columns. The statue at the top of the column is Lord Rowland Hill, who was a local man and another MP for the town, who fought at the Battle of Waterloo and was later Commander-in-Chief of the whole British Army. And if you want to go into the column, there's a spiral staircase and a viewing platform below the statue, which you can go up if you're there on the right day.
Wow. I mean, I feel like there's many other buildings we could and should mention. I mean, St. Mary's Church, with its different layers of sandstone, I think it's an extraordinary sight. The Market Hall. Shrewsbury is replete with really important, we mentioned 600 listed buildings, I think 14 are Grade 1 listed. So there's the odd modern building that does spoil the urban fabric for me, but it's a question of taste. So one building at the time I really didn't enjoy was the Lloyds Bank at the end of the high street. It sort of terminates the high street in an area full of like timber framed and old buildings. I've looked at the building on reflection. It's held in great esteem. I personally don't think it's in the right place, but that's a matter of taste. So whilst I think there's a huge array of really interesting, staggering buildings, there are some areas that don't quite work for me. So for me, it's going to be it's not going to be as high as Bath or Lincoln. It's going to be a 7.5.
Well, that's still a very good score. That's still going to be one of the best so far. If you don't mind, I'm going to indulge myself slightly with a summary from the 16th century from the poet John Leland, who wrote a little line about the town. He wrote, "The buildings high of Shrewsbury do shine both far and near. the town within a river set and land as it were, mounted upon a pretty hill, and bridges hath it twain, the name it took of older trees in British tongue men feign. And, this gushing description, apart from the fact the number of bridges has doubled, could really still apply today. And as you absolutely rightly said, we barely had time to focus on any particular buildings in the town. We can only give a sweeping summary. We haven't spoken about the Catholic Cathedral, the bridges, the old market hall that you mentioned, or the magnificent station, which is really right up with some of the best traditional railway architecture in the country. And I think this is all because of Shrewsbury's remarkable architectural preservation, which is based in part on the fact that there has been, in relative terms at least, and I'll underline that point because I'm going to return to it, not too much ugly post-war development there, which means, again in relative terms, fewer of these kind of ghastly modernist constructions or main roads cutting up the town centre. But I do have one gripe, and it is very similar to yours. While it absolutely in relative terms has suffered less than other towns, there have been plenty of unnecessary demolitions of old magnificent timbered houses to create the bus station and other buildings, and to create the Victorian market hall. So the town isn't completely untouched by ghastly modernism. And unfortunately, on the main road you take up from the station into the town centre, the further you get up Castle Street from the station down to the new market hall, the impression you get is that the town does start just to merge into this kind of generic 50s, 60s shopping scape you see in every English town centre. And unfortunately, it's not like the style in this area is even pioneering or makes some kind of unified architectural or political statement like in Coventry, say. I shouldn't overstate this because the development is certainly not very far from ubiquitous in Shrewsbury, but it's a shame it's placed right at the very centre of the town and really can dominate your entry to it when you arrive from the station. It surrounds Rowley's house and mansion, which was the very first brick house in the town, built by a local businessman, William Rowley, in 1618, and even surrounds the wonderful old market hall, which has a horrible modern office and retail building right up on one side. And what you do about this, I mean, we saw a solution to this kind of, I'll call it vandalism in Bath, where the modern shopping areas had been knocked down and redesigned in the local kind of neoclassical tradition with local sandstone. But that was a very particular solution, a very particular local vernacular. I don't personally have the imagination or the vision to propose a solution for Shrewsbury. And I suppose it's for this reason only, very similar to, I think, that Shrewsbury isn't getting a perfect score. It's just that first impression that you get needs to be countered by a fuller exploration of the town. But ultimately, as long as you have the time to make that fuller exploration, wander slightly away from this central street area, I think you absolutely will be rewarded. So it's a strong score for me as well, definitely. I'm going to give it a 7.5 too.
Okay, then it's the final scoring round. It's reality versus expectations. And here we just reflect on how our visit went compared with how we thought it would go. How famous was the town? Did it live up to its expectations? And for me, it certainly did exceed expectations. And I do keep saying this. I don't know if we're just going to good places, but I thought it would be much quieter. I had this idea in my head that it was a nice, attractive town, but there was more going on there. Far more history, a far more extensive historic town centre than I anticipated. Many more attractions of interest, huge number of buildings we could have talked about and taken more time on. I also think that it's a pleasant part of the world. It's the Shropshire countryside is very lovely. I was fortunate enough to visit in the autumn as well. And you've got nearby Telford and Ironbridge, which will be a separate episode eventually. So for me, and I think you'd agree, we had a good time when we were there, as did our friends that joined us. Were impressed very much by the town. In fact, one thing I noticed was a lot of the people with us, they commented on how surprised they were. They thought there'd be less there. So for me, it's got to be a positive score. It will be a 6.
I'll tell you what I love about Shrewsbury. take one example with that prison. They have just got on and done something with it. In Lancaster and in Reading, me particularly, was moaning about the lack of public use of grand public civic architecture with the prison in Reading and the castle in Lancaster. But in Shrewsbury, it's just happened, and I absolutely love that. But even moving beyond the layout and the architecture of the town, which I had some expectation of being very impressive, in trade, really, is there a town of this size that we've covered so far that has punched so far above its weight for so long? And it may lack in modern day heavy industry, but it's still a side to Shrewsbury that you might just not know anything about or really consider seriously enough. And I could probably say the same about politics and war and its influence on important regional, particularly, and some national matters. And in culture, there's a really nice spread, not just of things to talk about, but also things to do there and celebrations of British and English culture. So Shrewsbury might already be known as a historic town. We have to concede that. So the score can't be anywhere near the top of the range, but I think it more than lives up to that building. And it's my research and our visit there presented us with brand new facets to the town's history and heritage that I'd never even considered. So I'm also going to still give it a positive score. For me, it's going to be a 6.5.
Well, that's nearly the end of the episode, but how could we get through an episode of Ye Olde Guide without mentioning a football ground? You didn't mention Gay Meadow, which no longer exists, but I expected you to mention Gay Meadow and the guy in the boat collecting the footballs.
Oh, the guy in the boat, yeah. There's a famous picture of a small boat, I think they're called a coracle, hung up at the back of the stand at Gay Meadow, because the ground was built right next to the River Severn, next to that loop of the river, and it wasn't a particularly big ground, so flying footballs ending up in the river was quite a common occurrence. So there's one chap whose job it was just to sail out on his little boat, pick up the balls and fetch them and bring them back to the ground.
Fantastic. Sadly, Gay Meadow is no longer there. You have to go to a modern ground on the edge of town. That's just progress. But anyway,
progress to some.
Thank you everyone for listening. And if you do have any comments, thoughts, anything we've missed on Shrewsbury, anything we got wrong, please go to the website yeoldeguide.com. You can find all our other episodes there, including the league table and links to notes on all the other episodes. And please do join us next time. We have several other exciting towns and cities we visited in the pipeline, haven't we, Daniel?
There's places we're thinking of. We've got Hull, we've got Buxton, Warrington on the list at some point.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.